What does a systematic approach to philosophy look like? Well, Aristotle's Organon, a collection of logical and epistemological works, sets forth a systematic approach to doing philosophy. And it is in fact Aristotle in the Western tradition, if there is really such a thing, who founds what's known as first order logic or predicate logic and first establishes in the West deductive reasoning or deductive logic. So I'm going to be taking a look at that in this lecture video. Aristotle sets forth the categories. These are a kind of way of dividing up reality, of speaking about the world in a systematic way by looking at the essences of things and attributes to essences that aren't essential to the being of the subject being inquired about. For Aristotle, the primary reality or substance is the individual in which the forms participate. Or this can also be translated as thinghood. So unlike certain arguments in perhaps Plato's Republic or the Symposium or whatever else, where the being of a thing is dependent on some other forms, like for example, if we wanted to talk about this cat right here being beautiful, okay, this beautiful cat is beautiful because it participates in the form of beauty. And beauty is ultimately some immaterial form. For Aristotle, it's a different way of approaching it, where the essence of this beautiful cat, actually, or the form of beauty, resides in, right, participates in the cat itself, and not the other way around, where the cat is participating in the form of beauty. Now, of the categories, there are 10 kinds. So there is substance, which is the first category, and it's actually understood in two different ways. So we can think of primary substance as being. So primary substance is that which exists in general. Secondary substance are particular beings or particularly existing things, like a human, like me, myself, Austin, a horse, a cat, like Marshmallow here, a tree, and so on, right? And we can kind of think of this as being a matter of having a genus and then a species, where for Aristotle, a human is a rational animal. So a human is a species of animal, but is a bit different than other animals because it also is a rational animal. So it's under the genus of rational beings. Whereas, according to Aristotle, sadly as it may be, Marshmallow here is not rational, and so is merely a species, a particular being of the more general category of being cat, and then more general than that category, animal. The other categories are known as accidents. These are kind of attributes or traits of beings, right? Of a substance. So you can talk about a quantity, like we could say there are two cats in this house, although there's only one cat here with us. We could talk about the quality of this particular cat, right? So this cat has grayish hair. Now that's not essential to being a cat, right? You can have cats of many different kinds of colors and so on, right? Or like I am basically bald. But that's not essential to Austin, and that's definitely not essential to being a human being, right? It's merely a certain kind of attribute that is part of the form of the being of a human being, like baldness, for example, is an accident, but you can have human beings, therefore, that aren't bald, right? So they're not part of the substance of a human being or the essential nature of a human being. The other categories are relative, so we can talk about in relation to other beings, whether, this cat is smaller or larger than other cats. We can talk about where the cat is. The cat is in my office here in my apartment. We can talk about when, right now, of course, if you're watching this video, it might be yesterday, a year ago, or whatever else, when this cat was here in this place. We can talk about being arranged, like this cat is lying here on the desk. We can talk about things on, right, the being. In this case, there is nothing on the cat, but we do have bow ties here. But I could put the bow tie on. And again, right, so it's not essential the cat be here laying down. It's not essential the cat be wearing a bow tie to be a cat. These are all accidental attributes of this particular cat. And it is of the possibility of cat that they can, for example, wear bow ties or lay here, you know, on a desk or whatever. Although not all cats can lay on this desk, just this particular cat. And the other one, Sky Bear, but she's not here. So doing, like, Marshmallow likes to lick my fingers. I don't know why. And she also likes to disturb me when I record lecture videos. It's part of her thing, actually. Whenever I'm sitting here, this is something that she does. Now, this might be something that someone might want to say, well, this cat, right, it is essential to the cat Marshmallow to disturb Austin when he is at his desk doing work. It might make sense, right? Because if Marshmallow wasn't doing that, we might want to ask, well, is this Marshmallow? But again, the problem is, because Marshmallow is a species of the genus cat, it must be the actuality of all cats. And all cats do not behave the way Marshmallow does, so it is not in Marshmallow's nature to bother me at the desk. Like Sky Bear right now is not bothering me. It's merely an accident that Marshmallow does that. But Marshmallow could exist without doing that. And so finally being affected. Like, I'm petting Marshmallow. It's not essential that Marshmallow be pet to be a cat. But right now, right, in this particular case, Marshmallow is being pet. Okay. So that's a way to understand the natures of things. And here is where the question arises. Is logic, right, the way we articulate truth claims that this here Marshmallow is a cat, right? That's a proposition, right? It's saying it is the case that Marshmallow is a cat, right? So it's a statement about reality. The question is logic, right, a way of structuring claims like I'm a human being, this is a cat, there is such a thing as truth, or whatever else, right? All these kinds of things. Is logic part of philosophy, or is it a tool philosophy uses? So Aristotle begins, or the first text is the categories, right? And so we began with the categories, right? Where we already carved up the world, and then we talk about cats and other things on the basis of on the basis of using logic, right? But the categories can be justified logically, right? Which is why there's a distinction between accident and substance. And we can make a claim about whether, right, a justified claim, so one with propositions, right, which articulate the reason for why, for example, according to Aristotle, it is merely an accident that Marshmallow has grayish hair, but it is not essential that Marshmallow have grayish hair. That's a debate we can put aside, but I just want to mention that because this is something that we're going to see. For as much as Aristotle systematizes philosophy, there are still some ambiguities, and this is one of those ambiguities, the relationship between logic and really ontology. And that's really what this lecture video is about. It's not merely about Aristotle's establishing of a method to doing philosophy, but it is also a way to see the way in which ontology is intricately tied to logic and vice versa. And we'll see that at the end of this lecture video, and the way in which this then informs his other texts like the Physics and the Metaphysics. Okay, so when we speak about things, in philosophy, when we speak about things, we speak about things as having truth values, as either being right, true or false. So if I were to merely say cup, that's not really a claim that, about the truth or the falseness of like this cup or cups in general or whatever else, right? If I just say, I am sitting in this chair, right? Now that is a proposition, right? Because it's making a claim. It's saying it's true that I'm sitting here, right? That's kind of a representation of reality, or it's a correct depiction of reality, really. Arguments then are a series of propositions that attempt to justify one single or multiple amount of propositions. You can have as many propositions as you need, or these are called premises, and you can, out of that, create as many conclusions as are logically possible. And we'll see some of those in a moment. But the kind of logic that Aristotle establishes, known as predicate logic or first order logic, this begins with attributes of substances, right? So there are 4 different ways then to speak about things. We can talk about them universally or particularly. And then, so for example, right, all SRP. So if I made the claim, all cats are gray-haired, right? That would be a claim about all of the beings that are, that are cats, right? Of the category cat. And I said no SRP, so no cats are gray-haired. They do not possess gray hair, right? That would be a universal claim, again, about every single cat of the category cat. Now then if I start talking about like some S are P, some S are not P, some cats are gray-haired, some cats are not gray-haired, right? We can see, I think, the distinction where when we start talking about universals, most of the time, right, this is a claim about the nature of something, its essence. As where if we start talking about particulars, like some S are P, some S are not P, that's a claim about accidents, right? Accidental existences of a substance or an amount of substances. When we make claims about reality, like this cat is gray-haired, right? So this would be a particular proposition that I'm making here. If I were to also say this same cat right here, right now, Marshmallow, has gray hair and does not have gray hair. If I mean it in the same sense at the same time, this is a contradictory proposition. It is illogical, right? So I can't say that this one cat here, I can't say this thing here is both a cat and not a cat. I can't say that all cats are gray-haired and simultaneously all cats are not gray-haired, right? It's just a contradiction. Here we can see very clearly in saying all S are P and no S is P, right? These are mutually exclusive. You cannot have both at the same time. So any claim like that is illogical. And it's Aristotle, again, I should say, in the Western tradition that first establishes this law of non-contradiction. What it means to make a contradictory statement or proposition. Now, Aristotle lays out 2 ways of logical reasoning. The way in which he established deductive reasoning is a little bit different than the modern formulation. The same thing with inductive reasoning. But what I'm going to do is just articulate the modern forms of deductive and inductive reasoning, because these are the kinds of reasoning that we will engage in. Unless someone is very interested in the history of philosophy, then one can go and read the prior Analytics, for example, or other texts of Aristotle's Organon. Deductive reasoning is a kind of reasoning such that the argument, so the way in which premises are structured in leading to justify the conclusion, they're structured in such a way that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must necessarily be true, So a deductive argument is one that's structured such that if the premises are true, it could not be otherwise that the conclusion is false. Now, there are two ways of establishing deductive arguments or qualifying them. We can say that a deductive argument is valid or it is sound. Now, we really, of course, want a sound deductive argument, but that depends on empirical circumstances in terms of validation. A valid deductive argument is one where you have a logical structure such that it is the case that if all the premises of this argument are true, then the conclusion must be true. A sound deductive argument is one where it is valid and the premises are true. An example of this would be, for example, first premise, Rex is a dog. Second premise, all dogs are mammals. The conclusion, therefore, Rex is a mammal. So it cannot be otherwise that if Rex is a dog and all dogs are mammals, that Rex is not a mammal. Right? And we can draw a Venn diagram. So if you draw a circle, okay, and you label that mammals, according to, right, talking about like premise 2, right? And then inside that big circle that's mammals, we draw another circle inside of it that's wholly located inside the circle mammals, and we label that dogs, okay? That would be to kind of depict what premise 2 is saying. Now, premise 1 is saying Rex is a dog. So we have the big circle that's mammals, the smaller circle inside the mammal circle that's dogs, and a particular being within the circle dogs that is Rex. So when we see it drawn out, it's clear that if premise 1 and 2 are true, then Rex must be a mammal, right? So this is one example of how we can use logical reasoning to come to know true things. The second kind of reasoning is inductive reasoning. Whereas deductive reasoning gives you certainty, inductive reasoning gives you probability. Deductive reasoning begins from general principles to argue about particular cases. Like, for example, starting from general principles about what dogs are, what mammals are, looking at one particular account of a being called Rex, and then determining based on those principles, Rex is indeed a mammal. Inductive reasoning proceeds from the opposite way. It starts from particular accounts to form one general principle. For this reason, inductive reasoning deals in probabilities. An inductive argument is an argument that is structured such that if then the premises are true, the conclusion is likely true. Again, there are two ways to qualify an inductive argument. First is strong. This is similar to the case of a valid deductive argument. So a strong logical inductive argument is structured such that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is likely true. But you really, of course, want a cogent inductive argument where you have that logical inductive structure and then the premises are true. An example of an inductive argument is this first premise. 80% of students at the school are religious. Premise 2. Sadio is a student at this school. So conclusion, Sadio is probably religious, right? So if it's the case that 80% of students in the school are religious, then it's a mere matter of probability that if we pick out any random student at that school, that they are more likely than not to be religious, if it is the case that 80% of students at that school are religious. So notice then, this can't give you certainty that Sadio is religious, only the likelihood that Sadio is religious. So I want to look at some examples here of inductive and deductive arguments. I'm just going to go over the first one on each of these two slides. If you would like, you can pause the video and try to indicate them yourself, whether this is an inductive or a deductive argument, and whether it is, therefore, if it is deductive, a valid or invalid argument, and whether, if it is an inductive argument, it is a strong or weak inductive argument. So this first argument here. The meerkat is a member of the mongoose family. All members of the mongoose family are carnivores. Therefore, it necessarily follows that the meerkat is a carnivore. This would be a deductive argument, right? It's making a claim about a certain category of beings, saying there's this one particular thing, and if it is that particular thing, therefore it inhabits all the traits that that group of things inhabit. Okay, look at the next slide here, the first one. The rainfall in Seattle has been more than 15 inches every year for the past 30 years. Therefore, the rainfall next year will probably be more than 15 inches. This is an inductive argument. And sorry, I should have said in the last one, it's a valid deductive argument. And this here is a strong inductive argument because it's saying there's a certain trend that has been observed. Therefore, because this trend exists, it is more likely than not that the trend will continue. Right? All things being the same. Okay, so you can look at the rest of these if you would like and try to answer them for practice. Okay, now, how does this kind of reasoning work? How can we make any true claims at all? How can we have knowledge of truth itself or particular truths, right? Aristotle says that to know anything, we must presuppose either, one, that something is asserted or denied truly, right? That what is asserted or denied is a matter of certainty, of universality, that it cannot be otherwise. And so this is a certain presupposition about what truth is. Or two, that we must grasp the essence of the subject under question, which therefore confines what can be said about that object, the truth or falsity about that object. So, for example, we would have to know that X is a triangle before we can assert, right, the truth account of it having two right angles, if it is, for example, a right triangle. Now, there might be a response to this, which is, well, this actually isn't possible at all. We can't, or it doesn't seem clear that we can know anything at all. This is articulated in the paradox of Plato's dialogue, the Meno. So in that dialogue, it is claimed, a man cannot inquire either about that which he knows or about that which he does not know. For if he knows, he has no need to inquire. And if not, he cannot. For he does not know the very subject about which he is to inquire. So the paradox, right, is if we want to have knowledge, well, we would have to already know what it is we want to have knowledge about, which means if we already know what it is we want to have knowledge about, we wouldn't inquire to have knowledge about that thing in the first place. If I do not know what it is I need to have knowledge about, then I wouldn't have knowledge that I need to inquire about that thing in the first place. And so in both ways, I can't have knowledge about that which I want to inquire into. Aristotle's response to this is, as he says, I think it is quite possible for us to know in one way what we are learning, while being ignorant of it in another way. For what is absurd is not that we already know in some way the very thing we are learning. The absurdity arises only if we already know it to the precise extent and in the precise way in which we are learning it. So he says, yes, it would be true that we couldn't inquire into something if we needed to know the thing in its entirety to be interested in knowing about it. But he says what we can do, though, is know something, right? We can grasp in some way or encounter something in some way that makes us interested in learning more about it. Now, we actually see this in the role of experience. For Aristotle, experience is important, but it is not necessary for knowledge and understanding. That most often when we do come to know things, it's first experience that intrigues us, that first acquaints us with the things which we come to know. So experience results from repeated perceptions of things, right? That I see a kind of trend over and over, like I see certain things that hold water. I form memories about my particular encounters, the perceptions of these things, like mugs or cups. Then working back from the beliefs, right, about these things like mugs or cups, I can make possible both practical knowledge or a kind of a practical wisdom, which in the Greek is techne, a kind of art, a skill that is not a matter of systematic absoluteness in terms of when you approach it, it's the same way every time. So, of course, if I'm a craftsman and I want to create a mug, I possess a certain knowledge in how to create the mug. But, of course, the materials I deal with, I have to treat those materials in each way, both generally and particularly, because the materials are different every time, right? Might have certain consistencies every time. But experience is also, we can work back from our beliefs formed from experience to develop technical or scientific knowledge, which is those of universal truths about things in general, right, that cannot be otherwise, that aren't concerned with mere action or consequences or producing things. So that kind of practical knowledge or practical wisdom, so we might say like the master craftsman possesses a certain kind of practical wisdom and their ability to teach others of how to make mugs, for example, if that's what they produce. So there's a thing that is produced, there's a consequence to it in terms of creation. With scientific or technical knowledge, Aristotle thinks that it is not concerned with benefits. It is concerned with the structure of all things, or the structure of particular things, right, that lead to the production of objects like mugs. So he says, clearly then, we must recognize the first things by induction, for that is also how perception produces the universal in us. So induction plays a kind of medium role. It's a kind of means to an end, but it is not sufficient in itself to have knowledge. Why is induction not sufficient for knowledge? For Aristotle, knowledge is that which cannot be otherwise. So knowledge is absolute, universal certainty that is ultimately acquired deductively. So it is deductive reasoning that is sufficient, both necessary and sufficient for knowledge. Because if a deductive argument is valid, then if its premises are true, we know for a fact, right, the truth value of the conclusion. Additionally, such knowledge, as well as inductive reasoning, but especially deductive reasoning here in this case, is demonstrable, and that it is always proven necessarily by justification, right? Such knowledge involves certain articulations of premises that necessarily justify the conclusion. So if we always want to inquire, how do I know such and such? Well, I can look at the premises or the propositions, right, that justify the conclusion. So this is a bold claim, right? So that which we come to know, we can only know if it has always been the case, for it cannot be otherwise. Now, this is not to say that, I can't know that I'm sitting here in this chair. In a certain way, I can know that I'm sitting here insofar as it's probably likely true, right? And for all intents and purposes, I can act on that. It makes sense, or I'd be justified to act on the belief that I'm sitting here in this chair talking to a computer to record a lecture video. Now, the later empiricists like Locke or Hume, Berkeley, and so on, right? They have more to say about the role of induction. But for Aristotle, that's not enough, because it can never be certain. And truth is that which cannot be otherwise. Therefore, knowledge, we have knowledge only if that object of which we know cannot be otherwise. There are two objections Aristotle entertains about knowledge requiring demonstration. The first objection says that the requirement of demonstration leads to an infinite regress, which would mean we can't have knowledge. Right? So it would say, well, if all knowledge must be justified, well, knowledge of those propositions that justify the conclusion, those also must be justified. And then those propositions which justify the propositions which justify the conclusion must be justified. And then to know, right, and so on and so forth, right? It just leads to an infinite regress, similar to, what was mentioned in the Theaetetus, with the problem of the last definition, that knowledge is true opinion with an articulation. The second objection to Aristotle's claim that knowledge requires demonstration is to say that, well, if knowledge requires demonstration, then everything must be demonstrable, whether through circular reasoning or not, right? That if knowledge requires demonstration, then knowledge can be circular, and therefore, in that way, illogical. So it seems to contradict itself. Aristotle responds to both of these objections to say that not all knowledge is demonstrable, that there must be some kind of knowledge which is necessary, which is the necessary condition for the possibility of all other kinds of demonstrable knowledge. He says, indeed, it is evident that this must be so. For if we must know the prior things, i.e., those from which the demonstration is derived, and if eventually the regress stops, so if we want to say, well, there can't be an infinite regress because there must be some ultimately justified, foundation for the entire chain of premises, these immediate premises, he says, must be indemonstrable. Besides this, we also say that there is not only knowledge, but also some origin of knowledge, which gives us cognition of the definitions. So what Aristotle is saying here is there must be what is known as first principles. There must be principles which make possible all other principles. If all other principles depend on some other kind of principle, there must be, therefore, something which is just necessary in and of itself. He refers to first principles as indemonstrable knowledge, and really that is a kind of understanding, because it's a kind of knowledge that is not demonstrable. It does not have premises which support it. This kind of knowledge, this understanding, these first principles, are sufficient in themselves because they are the condition for the possibility of knowledge. In the physics, for example, he speaks about the fact that all things, to be actual, must contain possibility. So before this mug existed, it had to contain a certain potentiality. But that which makes possible the actuality of this mug had to be actually in existence. It too had to contain a certain kind of potentiality, right? You end up falling into an infinite regression, an infinite chain of actualities that preceded other potentialities that made possible those potentialities into actualities. So he ends up saying, there must be something which is necessarily actual, that never contained potentiality, because for there to be any potentiality at all, there had to have been something that necessarily existed. Right? This is known as the unmoved mover. And in the medieval Christian, Islamic, Judaic tradition, this becomes known as God, that God is that which has no prior cause. That's something for the physics, though, right? Here, we're just interested in the mere methodology of his logic and his approach to philosophy. So he says, among our intellectual states that grasp the truth, some, knowledge and understanding, are always true, whereas others, for example, belief and reasoning, admit of being false. And understanding is the only sort of state that is more exact than knowledge. Since the principles of demonstration are better known than the conclusions derived from them, and since all knowledge requires an account, it follows that we can have no knowledge of the principles. Since only understanding can be truer than knowledge, we must have understanding of the principles. The same conclusion follows from the further point that since the principles of a demonstration is not a demonstration, the principles of knowledge is not knowledge. If, then, the only sort of state besides knowledge that is always true is understanding, then understanding must be the principle of knowledge. Think about this with the deductive method. What justifies deduction, right? For the deductive method to be true in terms of its ability to make logical make possible logical conclusions, it has to be justified. Well, is it justified deductively? Well, it couldn't be inductively because, again, induction cannot provide certainty. So it would seem like it would have to be induction itself, which would have to be the justification of itself. But that leads to deduction being circularly justified and therefore illogical, right? Deduction cannot justify itself. Well, we know that if the premises are true in a deductive argument, and if it's structured validly, then the conclusion must be true. But what justifies that that structure, right? The guarantee of the conclusion in that structure. Aristotle says that it has to be something which is indemonstrable. It has to be an ontological necessity, which requires no other justification. That it is the justification for all other things. And that we can know this, not in itself because we can't articulate it, but we can know it through the effects of other true things that are made possible by first principles. And in this way, we can see here Aristotle's response to the aporia that ends Plato's Theaetetus. So next, I recommend we look at Aristotle's physics and metaphysics to see how this kind of method and logic is implemented.